Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Bonnie Hunter. I'm the Executive Director at North York Community House, and I'm so glad you could all join us today. I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces and some new ones, and great to have such a big group for this session. We're honored and thrilled, as always, to have Dr. Niigaan Sinclair back with us for this series so he can go deeper into the calls to action and how we can contribute to making them happen. I'd like to thank our partners for this session, the Neighborhood Group and Toronto Southwest Local Immigration Partnership, for making it possible. Now, some of us, myself included, have struggled with territorial and land acknowledgements because they can feel performative. So today we've decided to acknowledge in a different way, and that's with gratitude. By integrating a version of the Thanksgiving address, we acknowledge relationship, and we're engaged in integrating a key foundation of an Indigenous worldview. And that's a good beginning for living well on this land that for many of millennia has been and still is homeland of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of the Credit, the Huron-Wendat, Erie, Neutral, and the Métis. And I'd like to thank our reconciliation coordinator, Joan Frame, for that version of the message as she shared it with me. And now I'd like to pass it over to her.
There we go. Can you hear me? Sorry about that, everybody. Technology. Hi. I'm so glad that everybody could make it today, and thank you for sharing your lunch hour with us. I can't think of anybody better to lead us through the calls to action than Niigaan Sinclair. He's an old friend of ours. As you know, he's also a professor at the University of Manitoba. He's also a columnist at the Winnipeg Free Press, and just recently won the Columnist of the Year award. Yay! And he's also the Governor General award-winning writer for nonfiction for his book Wînipêk, which I highly recommend everybody goes to buy right this moment, or well, after words. The calls to action are something that we hear about all the time, but I don't think that many of us really know much about them. And they really are foundational to reconciliation. I think they're really important. If we're going to talk about reconciliation, we have to talk about them. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Sinclair.
That was so great. I started doing something else because I was like, oh, this is going to take a little while. Joan's going to talk about the TRC. And but nope. Then it was a quick turnaround. I like that. Keep me on my toes there. All right, everybody. So bonjour, everyone. I'm going to be terrible and just pin myself because it's much easier than looking at all your beautiful faces and being distracted and thinking, oh, well, that's a nice cat over there, So. I think what I'm going to do instead is just to pin myself. I have lots of different things to say this morning, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the TRC. And my family and I are just preparing today. We're running around getting things organized because tonight the first of 3 schools will be officially unveiled, named after my father. Of course, my father passed away in November of 2024, and we had to wait a year to say his name. And so we are now in the busy phase of talking about things that will be either named after or honoring or commemorating in some way Dad's legacy. And so that's what we're doing today. So I sort of was out this morning doing different things, talking to the principal, those kinds of things. And so we're getting ourselves organized. But I'm very happy to spend this hour with you, and certainly happy to come back to the North York Community House and all the different great people there. And I know there's a number of other partners too. Here's the thing about working with Joan. Not only do you then get thrust into the center of all these different conversations, but you often, she'll text you and then you'll say, sure, that sounds like a great idea. And next thing you know, you're doing a 4-part series, online series with hundreds of people. And so I will say that, I'm very lucky to know Joan. And I don't know if you all know how lucky you are to know Joan, but she's literally like the center of hundreds of circles across, Southern Territory, Dish with One Spoon territory. And so it's very lucky that we get to have such a huge giant of kindness and love and generosity in our circle. So thanks to Joan for putting this all together. Thanks to everybody at who's been to sessions. Thanks for everybody coming to the Nathan Phillips Center just a little while ago. The lodge that was right in front of Nathan Phillips there, and a great crowd that came out. And of course, we were all talking about this study group that we're going to do together. So let's get to the slides now. I need to be enabled to be sharing. So we need to test that earlier. Sorry. You need to enable me to be able to share things. So those at North York, you need to make me some sort of co-host or something like that. There we go. There we go. Yeah, perfect. There, I see. There it is. Okay. There we go. I'm happy to make these slides available to everybody. I don't know what platform we could use. I don't really know how to do all that stuff. I am a self-confessed Luddite, meaning I don't understand technology all the time. And so I'll do the best I can to go through these 56 slides that I have for you. But of course, it's impossible to talk about 94 calls to action in any sort of manageable way, and never mind a 4-part series. And so I texted Joan this morning and I said, what do you think about this concept? I'll try this out. And she thought it was a good idea. So we'll go with this. I'm going to talk about the concept of the TRC today. And you've met me, you've heard about my book and that kind of thing. Thanks to, shameless self-promotion, if you get a chance to read my book, everything I say will be in much bigger detail in that, or in the book that I'm currently working on, which is around love as duty. And most importantly, sort of imagining, love isn't a Hollywood thing for Indigenous peoples. Love is very much about treaty, and it's about commitment, and it's about sharing the land. So that's what I'm writing about now. So this definitely sort of comes into all of this. But session 1 today is going to be like, what is the TRC? Like, what was the concept of the TRC? And so that's going to take about 10 minutes, and I'm going to go as quickly as I can through that. And then I'm going to ask the question today of, why do we begin with child welfare? Like, why is child welfare the calls to action 1 through 5? And then we're going to just jump all the way to the calls for health and justice, which are in what's called the truth section, or what's called the legacy section of the TRC calls. That's going to be today. So we're basically going to deal with approximately 12, I think it's 7 or 8, and we're about 14 or so calls to action today. And then session 2 is going to be about specifically education, specifically calls to action 6 through 12, 12 through 17, those are language and culture and education. And then all the other calls that have a thread of education that go throughout. And some of those things are going to be talked about for today. So for example, people who work in the child welfare system, the healthcare system, justice system, they also touch upon education. But we're going to talk about education as a concept, and what Dad would often say in terms of education, and what the TRC therefore put embedded within virtually all of the TRC calls to action, but definitely half of them verbally, overtly, talk about education. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. Session 3 is going to focus on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and specifically one call, the United Nations Declaration implementation called Action 43. There's a reason that the reconciliation section begins with the very first thing, which is Indigenous rights. And so we're going to ask the question of, how do rights impact everything from 43 to 94? And then we're going to talk about specific calls to action more at the end, and ones related to some of your work. So at the end of the month here, when we're finished our session of study group, we're going to talk about some very specific calls to action, the ones involving the church, the Catholic Church in particular, museums, media, sports, some newcomers, and of course business, which tend to be sort of at the end of the TRC calls 93, 92, and 93. So, okay. Now, one of these guys in this picture is my father. See if you can figure out which one it is. Obviously, I'm just joking around. Justin Trudeau is not my dad. My dad is the guy to the left. Now, A, look at how young Justin Trudeau is in this picture. B, this was 2015. This was in December of 2015, just after the federal election, where Justin Trudeau was elected as the prime minister. And he came up on the microphone and he said, "The federal government commits to all 94 calls to action, and we will implement them within my mandate." And he said, I was there in the room. I heard this exact words. I give you my word. I give you my word that the TRC calls to action, or the relationship between First Nations, Inuit, Métis people and the government of Canada, will be renewed. That's what he said. So I don't know if you've learned the news lately. They didn't quite happen. And what had happened, though, was arguably the 10 most progressive years in Canadian history. And I don't even want to argue about it. I can say arguably because I don't want to argue with people, but it's the truth. Justin Trudeau is the most progressive prime minister in Canadian history, but he's also the only prime minister to care. So the bar is real low. It's for progressivism. And no other federal government has ever cared. Paul Martin cared a little bit, basically, as he was heading out the door. But he didn't care enough to get reelected to implement what his vision was. And so generally, no other prime minister cared. In fact, every prime minister was brutal. Jean Chrétien, Stephen Harper, or the other way around, Stephen Harper, John Chrétien, Paul Martin, all those different steps. They were all brutal, absolutely atrocious. And not only that, but aggressive. And this is absolutely terrible, but my doorbell just rang. So I'm just going to leave that. And hopefully, if they ring it again, though, I might have to answer it. So my point of it is that we are in a very interesting phase. And that period from 2009 to 2015, when the TRC traveled the country, did national events, studied the issue, and then came up with a roadmap for us. I'm not going to revamp that. I'm not going to revisit that time period. I'm not going to talk about how important it was that the government of Stephen Harper sort of solidified unified support, and then brought the issue of reconciliation to light through the apology, through the settlement agreement, through the courts, but that the survivors then wanted a path of reconciliation. They wanted a path in which people would look at each other, work together, and take steps together to be able to engage each other in a meaningful process to make sure that A, residential schools never happened again, but that B, we would make sure that we would then be able to build a foundation for all children. Notice I didn't say Indigenous children there. I said for all children, for Indigenous children, for Canadians, whether they be newcomers, whether they be multi-generation Canadians, that everybody in every sector can work together. Now, we're going to revisit the concepts of the TRC throughout all 4 sessions of our online conversation, our study group. But after the 6 years, 2015, and I could tell you so many stories of the TRC, having traveled with it, seen the national events, those kinds of things. I don't have time, so hopefully, maybe I'll talk about it. If maybe I'll have a question about the Q&A and that kind of thing, like what did I see, or what were the biggest moments, or those kinds of things. But the TRC calls to action presented to the federal government in June 2015, and then therefore the final report, December 2015, presented to Justin Trudeau a month after, or 6 weeks after he's been elected, were 94 calls to action, which was supposed to be a roadmap for the country. Now, calls to action 1 through 42 are what's called legacy, meaning that those are the things that have been created directly out of residential schools. Those are the things, institutions that have already impacted us and continue to impact us. Call to action 43 through 94 are brand new things that have never been created before. And that means that we have to engage a process. As you may have noticed, 43 through 94 is the majority. We're going to have to make a lot more new things than we will to engage and change the old things. But the old things, they start first, because the old things are what are harming everybody, what are creating division and sowing this terrible, terrible idea, which is that Indigenous peoples have been taught by this country to feel ashamed, and Canadian people have been taught to feel superior. And this radical imbalance results in for the most part, Canadians, whether you're a newcomer or whether you are a multi-generation Canadian, having access, not always receiving it, but access to more wealth, access to opportunities, more opportunities, and absolutely not having to worry about certain policies that are directed towards a racialized group of people. Of course, there have been racialized policies. I'm thinking about internment during World War II. I'm thinking about the head tax that was placed on people from China and or immigrants or newcomers from China. Those kinds of things. Like obviously, there have been racism in this country against certain groups of people, but nobody has had a sustained series from the first second of Confederation to absolutely right now that has been a series or an ongoing sense of oppression, targeting, marginalization more than Indigenous peoples. That's where those institutions have to be changed because they create these problematic behaviors, problematic imbalances, and what we call the gap. When we get to education, we'll talk a little bit more about that gap. But anyway, so 43 to 94, brand new things never been created before. Now, every time I'm going to assess these calls to action, I'm going to then gesture to some of the work that's being done by the Yellowhead Institute, which is at formerly Ryerson University, now Toronto Metropolitan University. They used to do an annual report. They've sort of given up on this because they have seen that the calls to action have stagnated. Or the really incredible website done by my uncle, Doug Sinclair, called Indigenous Watchdog. I recommend both institutions, be researched, investigate them, go to support them, donate if you can, because both of them need funds to continue to do this work. They are the ones who have their finger on the pulse of these calls to action. In fact, these are the two institutions that I consult the most, that I look to, because they are the ones who are watching every single day. This policy, for instance, of the sovereign wealth fund that the federal government just proposed, what they are doing is they have researchers that look to that and say, does that address some of the calls to action, either overtly or is it kind of indirectly? And so that's where, Indigenous Watchdog, particularly my uncle Doug Sinclair, he's actually my cousin, but I call him my uncle, my dad's cousin. He's an incredible resource. And so I would actually encourage you to check him out, bring him in to speak and, spend some time with him. And he's a really wonderful guy. And he thinks very deeply about the TRC calls to action too. But let's start with child welfare. Now, there's a reason that after the residential school period, the period in which more children were physically removed from their families, from their cultures, from their traditions, that we begin with child welfare. That's intentional. That is not just some random, and I want you to think about that. I want you to think about why it is that child welfare is the most devastating policy in Canadian history when it comes to the, not even the post, would we really call it post or, in many ways, the child welfare system has continued the legacies of residential schools. Now, we can talk about all of these different things, and I'll just give you a little brief history lesson. The purpose of residential schools was to become a child welfare system because it was intended to replace parents. It was intended to take children from their families, cultures, traditions, and then assimilate them into a problematic system where they would become something else. That doesn't come without a whole lot of trauma, a whole lot of pain and suffering. And I'm not even talking about physical sexual abuse. I'm talking about Phyllis Webstat was given orange shirt, sent to residential school at St. Joseph's Mission. She got there. Not only was her hair cut, she was put through a terrible process in which she never learned a thing. She was forced to work most days. But she was annoyed, like, what happened with my orange shirt that my grandmother gave me so that I would always be proud of myself. Like, that's how demeaning that system was. Don't let anyone ever tell you that residential schools was a good policy for anybody. I'm not even talking about children now. I'm talking about the people who worked in it, the teachers, the nuns, the priests. They were all traumatized too. And not only were they totally inept and incapable, and therefore most often violent and divisive and harmful when it came to being in a system that they were not ready for, that was full of violence, that was full of the very basic process was that we were to turbulently, violently, at any means necessary, change children from this into this, which is horrible for any people to go through. But it was also that those who ran the system were also put into a kind of indoctrination. And it was the idea that Canadians are better than Indigenous peoples, or Catholics or Anglicans or United or Christians are better than Indigenous peoples, and they know what's best. And so it was an extremely harmful process for everybody. And it wasn't just those who worked in the schools, those who paid for the schools, taxpayers, those who worked on airplanes that flew those children, those who worked in the RCMP, who brought the children back when they would run away or go to their families in September and forcibly remove them. It was the storekeeper. It was the citizen in the community. It was the person who was the custodian who was hired to work part-time at the school. Every single person was impacted by residential schools. There is nobody that's not impacted. And therefore, the legacies have also been impacted. And the thing that we see the most, if you want to see what's the number one institution, it's child welfare. More children are removed now often due to situations that are not of Indigenous people's choosing, poverty, situations of outcomes of poverty, which sometimes can be domestic situations, can be addiction, could be living in a neighborhood that's over-policed and therefore has an increase in acrimonious relationships with police, which may result in, for instance, an increase in gangs or an increase in a sense of community patrols that don't look like community patrols, that then therefore have a battle with the police. That's actually the whole story of what Minneapolis looked like in the 1970s and 1980s. My whole point is that child welfare has created a real sense. And if you come to the prairies, 90% of the child welfare system is Indigenous, and in Ontario, no better. Quebec, Maritimes, everywhere west of here, and particularly the north. Um, you can see that child welfare has then bled, spread, permeated through every element of Canadian society, whether it be in jails, whether it be in the continuation of child welfare in communities, whether it be in housing, or the ideas that there's no ability to be able to have a connection to your culture, language, tradition, to your parents, and that leads to a whole sense of mental health challenges and so on, and shame and those kinds of things. Now, I don't mean to be all down to the doldrums here. I mean to tell you that there is something being done about it now, and people are only waking up to the long legacy of what child welfare has done. Now, one of those people is Cindy Blackstock. Cindy Blackstock has spent her whole career to fighting the huge issues that child welfare has created and has contributed to as a result of the residential school period, which then hasn't been dealt with. Of course, there are Canadian laws that was supposed to stop this. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child has been adopted for many years by the Canadian government, going back almost 7 decades. And still, none of this stopped the residential school period because, of course, Indigenous people are not humans. They were not deemed as human. They were deemed as something lesser than human. And they didn't have, according to the Canadian government, Canadian law, for a long period of time, going back to the papal bulls of the 15th century by the Catholic Church, the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the British North America Act, which said both those things are legitimate. Those things led to Indigenous children being directly harmed and harming today. Now, there's many calls to action that try to engage the child welfare system, and some of them have been addressed in various different ways. Now, I don't have a better way to deal with 94 calls to action other than to just drop it in a slide. I hope that you get it. I hope that you research it. I hope that you read more about it. I can't, in the 1 hour that I have with you, and I'm already halfway done here, impossible for me to say, okay, let's look at call to action number one, very first call to action that seeks to deal with child welfare. Why is it that we struggle so much with monitoring, just keeping an eye on children in the child welfare system, trying to keep Indigenous families together, make sure that all people who work with Indigenous families, social workers in particular, are trained adequately, and that we make sure that they provide solutions? And that when we consider all the solutions involving Indigenous peoples, we realize that nobody has experienced the removal of their children in the same level, at the same degree, at the same great deal of harm that Indigenous communities have. So we have to think of that specifically. We have to really address the issue of residential schools and their legacies. Nobody has dealt with this problem before. And therefore, we are going to have to be innovative, creative. And that's what call to action number one is about. That's just call to action one. Like, just think about how big that is. If it's saying we need to monitor adequately and then provide resources, we realize something crucial. And it's going to be a theme that's going to happen throughout the rest of this study group as well. According to Indigenous Watchdog, according to the Yellowhead Institute, both of those organizations keep track of the 94 calls. They say things like, and according to both of them, they're round about the same. Some of them debate on whether certain ones have been completed or not. According to this morning, Indigenous Watchdog says that 13 of the 94 calls to action have been completed. I believe Yellowhead at their last report might have said 12. I'm going to argue that 14 are completed because everybody wants to debate on the papal one called Action 58. Pope ain't coming back. So I always say to people, it's done as much as it's going to get done. So, anyways, um, there are certain calls to action that will never be completed. And this is one of them, as well as most of the calls to action. I would say over half of them there will never be a point when we go check. Like, for instance, at what point will we determine that social workers and investigators are trained adequately in residential school history and their legacy? Is there ever a point we're going to go like this? Okay, done. We're done. No more training, everybody. You've learned it all. We're just going to trust that all the people coming in, they're all brilliant because the universities are doing their job. And all the people in high school, when they were learning, they all learned about the deep history of residential school. We're going to trust that all the high schools are doing that too. My point is, we're never going to finish call to action one. So we're always going to be in this tough situation when we think that the calls to action are going to be done. They are lifelong, eternal, forever processes that we need to be going through. Or at minimum, I mean, I'll be a bit more glass half full. This is what my dad was often say. He'd say, as much time as it took to create harm, we have to spend that amount of time getting out of harm or dealing with harm or coming up with solutions for harm. Okay, so let's imagine, when did residential schools start? We'll say about 1830, which is before Confederation. That's where the very first missionaries come up with the idea of taking Indigenous children from their family. They actually work with a few Indigenous peoples on that idea who are talking about starvation post-war of 1812. For the most part, we'll say 200 years. Optimistically, 150, let's say, right? Somewhere in between there. So it's going to take us at least 150, 200 years to even begin to complete some of these calls. So there's no point in keeping track and going 14 are done, check, and 40 approximately have some process that have been done, good, bad, great, ugly, but there are 40 that have never been touched. And that's what I think we should be focusing on. Now, one of them is not here. Like, this is one of those calls that have had some work done. Universities now require social workers for the most part. About, a good third of universities require social workers to learn about Indigenous peoples. They do it at a university. And then, of course, high schools across the country, many of which I speak in, which I train in, they are doing some work talking about residential school history and its legacies. So we would look at a call to action like number one and go, partially on its way, or some progress has been made. Now, other areas of one, though, have not happened. Like, is there a monitoring and assessing of neglected investigations? I would say that there is, from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, in which children started to be removed, or provinces were incentivized when child welfare was taken out of the hands of the federal government and then given to the provinces. And that would lead to what's called the 60s scoop, which was this massive removal of Indigenous children, just as the residential school period was coming down and children were being less and less taken away and forced into schools, because oftentimes Indigenous peoples were taking over those schools, like the Blue Quills, for example. As Indigenous peoples are starting to take over some of their own education in their own communities, just as that was happening, boom, the government sweeps in, provincial governments, and are incentivized to remove Indigenous children. And boom, instead of removing them to take them to school, though, you're now removing them, putting them in a whole different family, whole different culture group, whole different language, whole different urban setting, most often urban settings. And the residential school period very much just turned into something else, and it was the child welfare system. And so that's still happening. 2026, more children removed ever than there was during the residential school period today. And so my point of it is that I don't think we've monitored neglected investigations, and I certainly don't think that we've provided resources to keep Indigenous families together. So the answer to call to action one is some progress, but not enough, not even close to enough, much more work to do. Same thing with call to action two. There needs to be a national report. Same thing that there needs to be the implementation of Jordan's principle, which actually was doing fairly okay until this federal government came in. The federal government right now has just gutted and removed and refused to promise another year of Jordan's principle funding. Jordan's principle is the idea that Indigenous children, upon accessing provincial or federal services, don't have to get caught up in bureaucratic lingo. because First Nations kids, for example, they have to be paid for by the federal government because of the treaties. Métis children, for example, have specific agreements with provinces, but that regardless if it's a First Nations Métis child, you don't have to then get caught up in bureaucratic arguments. Where does this child belong? Who's going to pay for it? How are we going to, is it going to be the generic medicine or the name brand medicine? Is that approved by XYZ federal department, provincial department, whatever it might be? Call to Action 3 says, because of the death of a young boy named Jordan Anderson, who was caught up in that bureaucratic mess, he died because bureaucrats couldn't get their act in order. Jordan's principle has become a bit of a debacle at the federal level for a host of reasons. One is that they never defined what the program was in the first place. And so many Indigenous communities who were in dire need because of the chronic marginalization of the Indian Act then started to like, what is Indigenous children's health? Is it just medicine or a wheelchair or our prosthetic leg? Or is it also mental health? Does it include mental health? Is there hockey programs, mental health programs, father-son weekends where they do pancake breakfasts together and build a relationship with one another? Will that be able to deal with the issues of children's health? My whole point is that because it became so vast, the Jordan's Principle funding became kind of a catch-all for all these needs in First Nations. And the federal government didn't like that. And instead of dealing with the issue of all these needs that were happening everywhere, the federal government just simply cut off the funding for Jordan's Principles after next year. And so I would say Call to Action 3 has completely stalled. There was some progress and is now completely stalled. Child welfare legislation still has not come in. There is no national standards. Which is Call to Action 4. And Call to Action 5 is such an open-ended call. It's intended to encourage federal governments, provincial governments, territorial governments, and Indigenous governments to come up with culturally appropriate parenting programs for Indigenous families. So what does that look like? Language programs. It's about being proactive rather than reactive. Working to build good senses of fatherhood, motherhood, elderdom, children having positive experiences with, for instance, institutions in cities. Like, it's pretty wide open. I've often said in some of my work with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers or the Winnipeg Blue Jets here in the city, we bring Indigenous children into those circumstances where they see a professional sporting event. They have a really good experience. Sometimes they meet the players, sometimes they meet the management. They oftentimes get applause from those people within the arena or the football stadium. I've said that Call to Action number 5, part of that is involving not just governments, but also institutions, private businesses. And so I've said Call to Action number 5 has different manifestations all throughout society. And one of them might be through bringing them to a hockey game. And so, working, especially if parents and children are doing that together, that would be a culturally appropriate parenting program. But I will also say, learning about your culture, language, ceremony, tradition, spending time picking medicines together, those kinds of things. So, now, all of this was attempted to be dealt with one major piece of legislation called Bill C-92. C-92 was intended to download First Nations child welfare, Métis, Inuit child welfare, to those Indigenous-led organizations. Now, that has only happened minimally and only when Indigenous organizations have applied for it. But there has been, in the prairies particularly, a downloading of those services. But you can imagine the downloading of those services hasn't come with funding. And the provinces who are in charge of child welfare have kept that funding. They've said that, no, you have to come up with more funding of the federal government. And the federal government has sometimes forced the provincial government to give that money over because the children are no longer with the provincial government. They're with, Métis Child and Family Services, for example, or Dakota Plains, Dakota Plains Family Network, whatever that downloading service application took in, and they are now in charge of the child welfare on that First Nations, Inuit, or Métis community. But it hasn't come with the funding. It's usually come with a lot of struggle and a lot of atrophy, a lot of division. There's big structural issues. And all of this continues to be fought by Cindy Blackstock. Please go and research her. Please go and see the work that she's been doing and the applications she's been making to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. And also note that when there was finally a decision that the government agreed with and that's fulfilled, that the chiefs of Canada did not feel there was an adequate compensation package or a package that would deal with the structural issues that drive children into the child welfare system. They rejected that, and the federal government, instead of coming to the negotiating table again to rework that agreement, they just simply started to pick and choose who they want to work with. And they came with an agreement of the chiefs of Ontario, and now nobody else has any access, supports, resources to deal with the issue of child welfare. That's called a divide and conquer tactic, and it is highly problematic, and it is not ethical. It's not responsible. And what you have now is you have all the other provinces who have chiefs, child welfare agencies, chronically underfunded. More children are going to the child welfare system, and we've got a bigger problem than we did before. But this one little corner of Ontario, where there is a great deal of voters, they may see some change, and they may think that there's change happening, but there isn't. Now, at the same time, Indigenous peoples are coming up with ideas, engaging issues anyways. And that's the thing I want you to think about for the next two calls to action, justice and health, because we're going to see even less calls to action addressed in those areas. Because remember, we only had 5 there that we dealt with. We've still got a whole bunch of them, 24 through 42. 17 through 24. These are ones that are pretty big. But what you'll notice is that there is instances throughout the country, in child welfare in particular, of what First Nations, Inuit, Métis communities are doing anyways. And they're doing it often underfunded, they're doing it under-resourced, because the issue of children is so pressing in our communities. And I don't have a lot of more time to talk about that. So 18 through 24, let's quickly do health. Now, I come from this community right here. I'm from St. Peter's. We were forcibly removed off the land in 1907 from this spot right here. That was where I grew up. To this spot right here, that is lands that are always flooded out every spring. In fact, one thing that's been nice is we've had some snow in Winnipeg and Manitoba, southern Manitoba, past few days. That's actually slowed down the spring thaw and the flooding in our community. So the community's gone from a state of emergencies to a state of urgency. And that's a good thing. But my point of it is if you lived in houses that are always flooded out, you would end up like this. You would end up in hotels in the downtown Winnipeg. You would live there for most often years because your home is full of mold and destruction. And you would start to have issues of your family. You would have issues of truancy if you're a young person. I mean, how could you do grade 12, grade 9, grade 10, whatever it might be, in a hotel lobby? How could you do that? Now, I've been working frontline poverty for 30 years. I'm 50 years old. I started when I was 20. And I can tell you that the exponential increase is getting worse and worse of people in chronic health crisis. What are those crises? They are things that are problematic, that end up in even more problematic situations. So they starts with, yes, a cough. Yes, it starts with obesity. Yes, it starts with mental health, depression, for example. But that ends up in institutions, jails, ERs, and yes, death. In the case of Indigenous women in our territory, sometimes tragically, horrifically, landfills. My point is that if we had focused on Indigenous health, if we understand Indigenous health, we realize that it's good for everybody. But the problem is that the healthcare system doesn't think in an Indigenous way. It only thinks in terms of body. But Indigenous health is a holistic mind, body, heart, spirit. So that means that your heart, how you feel, your mind, how you think, and also your spirit, how you experience the world. That isn't religion. There is no Indigenous religion. You can't convert on a Thursday. What you are is you're an Indigenous person who is interacting with the world, hopefully in healthy ways. So what is that? Laying tobacco. It's telling a joke. It's drinking healthy water. And that means, or clean water. That means that Indigenous health considers everything, mind, body, heart, spirit. It's not just body, like how hospitals only focus on bodies, jam you full of medicine until somehow you magically turn better. When my father was in hospital, when he was very sick, medicine never helped him, or Tylenol never helped him. A diabetes medication never helped him, but music did. Being around his kids did. Hearing seeing the drum tied or touching the drum, hearing the drum played, that helped him. That's mind, body, heart, spirit, because that's what Indigenous peoples, that's how we operate. Now, I could keep going with this. I could tell you about ceremonies. I could tell you about the importance of the lodge in Nathan Phillips Square. I can tell you about the importance of understanding what feasting is, and I could tie all of that to suicide, cancer, diabetes, those kinds of things. I wrote the Movember report this year, which is a report on Indigenous men's health, and what we found was the top three killers are cancer, heart disease, and suicide. All of those things are preventable. They're all preventable. And the important thing of understanding that is that poverty created those three things. Marginalization created, racism created those three things. And so my point of it is understanding that Indigenous health is very much on an ongoing process or ongoing system of systems, sorry, that evoke trauma for Indigenous peoples. That's why we have to deal with the number one thing isn't about cancer, heart disease, and even suicide. It's trauma. We have to stop traumatizing Indigenous peoples by telling them they don't matter, by telling them that they live in these communities that are chronic, that are a bunch of welfare suckers and they don't do anything. And none of that's true. It's all a bunch of lies and propaganda. And going back to the residential school period, it was a legitimization of thinking of Indigenous peoples as savages that can't parent, they can't do anything with the land. We have to remove them off the territory. And that the outcome of that is those things, the health determinants that I spoke about. Now, colonialism is to blame, and this is where you come in. Every time you talk, every time you converse, go to a session like this, every time you then take action from what you have learned, you are starting to reverse that and change that because Indigenous peoples should not be doing the work of convincing non-Indigenous peoples that racism exists. We should accept it, the truth, and that we should understand that not just Indigenous peoples are getting harmed by this, but all Canadians are paying more for ERs, paying more for this massive amount of children removed from families. And not just that, but then resulting experiences in the healthcare system, justice system, all these things that are happening everywhere. The fact is that if we stopped trauma, we would all have a more efficient society, a more wealth-based, distributed economy. We would have an environment too that would be healthier. My whole point of it is that I could keep going and talk about, I could go through the TRC calls to action in relation to health. What you'll notice is that almost none of them have been employed. And if they have been employed, they've been employed regionally. But that the federal government is the one who is intended to, they're the ones who fund health. That's where healthcare transfers come from. The federal government collects taxes, sends it to the provinces. The province then distribute healthcare. The fact is that the federal government has really taken a weak position on this because they have both chronically controlled the issue of health at the federal level and done a terrible job at it for First Nations people and for Métis and Inuit peoples who are then often cared for by the territories or by the federal government or the provincial government, sorry, who have the allocation, the jurisdiction over healthcare. They've done a terrible job engaging Indigenous peoples that are under their jurisdiction. They have not acknowledged even the current state, other than perhaps saying that there's a problem. But there have been tiny little ways that we've tried to address those gaps. For instance, at the hospitals here in Winnipeg, there is an Indigenous healthcare unit inside of that hospital, inside of that institution. Often it's educational. It teaches staff, but also then advocates for Indigenous clients. So that's a good thing. That's a shortening of the gap. But the problem is, if you go to the ER in the downtown Winnipeg, it is still overwhelmingly Indigenous. And therefore, we are not going to deal with infant mortality, maternal health, suicide, mental health addictions, life expectancy, all those things that are on Call to Action 19. And we will not stop the murdering of Indigenous peoples. And I say that intentionally, murdering of Indigenous peoples in the healthcare system because of ignorant, flagrantly racist policies, individuals, and of course, the fact that Indigenous peoples are constantly seen as problems and problems that nobody wants to deal with. And whether it be nurses, doctors, those who pay for the system, the custodians who work there, the governments who oversee it. I mean, it's throughout the whole thing. And that is not converted and changed overnight, of course. It takes education, empathy, mutual respect, those kinds of things. But of course, Joyce Eschquan, died in October of 2020. Or not actually October of 2020, sorry. I can't remember the date actually, but it was before that. It was Joyce Echequan, of course, was a woman who died in a Quebec hospital due to just flagrant racism. Nurses who laughed at her as she was experiencing tremendous health problems, and then, of course, died literally until they finally cared, and it was too late when she had chronically already entered the healthcare system. Multiple doctors, multiple individuals, multiple policies led her to not get adequate healthcare, and I guarantee to you that if she was not Indigenous, she probably would have been dealt with differently. Arguably, if she had been Caucasian, she would have been absolutely still alive today. Now, there's a whole bunch of different ways the federal government has tried to deal with this. And one of the ways that they've been trying to deal with this was called Action 20, is trying to understand that there's distinct needs in certain communities involving health. And so you would say this is a call to action 20, which has been partially addressed, engaged in some way, because what has happened is, particularly in areas of mental health, the federal government has understood that certain communities experience state of emergencies more, that have understood that certain communities have their hydro lines burnt or flooded out more regularly, or need to evoke. This is where Bill C-91 comes in, that teaching the language actually cures suicide. So there has been a little bit of action in a few of the calls, 2021, which is things like physical, mental health, and spiritual harms, addressing those kinds of little things. In fact, arguably the TRC itself, which wasn't paid for by the federal government, it was paid for by survivors, has been a way in which there have been sort of addressing of certain harms that have been created due to residential schools. 22 is talking about Indigenous health practices and bringing in medicines, for example, alongside cancer treatments. And what this has done is this has created certain universities to result in training medical professionals in understanding Indigenous healthcare practices. So, for example, in my department, we have a course that we teach to nurses through the Ongamazin program at the Health Science Center, which is the downtown Winnipeg hospital, in which we teach them about traditional medicinal practices which can deal with things like menstruation, can deal with things like indigestion, can deal with things like cancer. And as a result, there is some progress on call to action 22, but this is one of those calls, just like 21, that we will never be done. And they are very regional and they need much more commitment, because I guarantee to you this is not happening in Nova Scotia or even Alberta, or in fact, I can remember there was, in Yellowknife, they attempted to bring that program in. The second that they had a misunderstanding or a conflict over Western health practices, certain cancer treatment, and Indigenous health practices, guess what always won out? It was always those recommended by certified physicians, not the traditional knowledge keeper in that area. So we still have this inequity that is believed Indigenous peoples are the problems, Canadians are the solutions. There has been, however, progress in Call to Action 23 in certain corners of the country as well. In Manitoba, we saw the record number of Indigenous doctors going through programs, about 10. And not in any way proportional to the doctors. There are 100 or so doctors accepted into the program every year. Sorry about that. But it is evidence that there is some steps being made by certain institutions, certain governments, and there's an incentivization in certain governments to realize that when you have Indigenous nurses, healthcare works better. Especially when they work with Canadian nurses to be able to bring the competency of that unit up, and also deal with the fact that there is more Indigenous peoples who are in the healthcare system, in ERs, for example, but also cancer wards and other facilities and so on. It makes the competency of everybody increase. Same thing with Call to Action 24. Now, Call to Action 24 talks about the United Nations Declaration, so we're going to touch upon that one a little bit in the United Nations Declaration discussion. Now, I've got to zoom through, and this is one of the problems, of course, with my study group here, is that we've got to do a lot of work, heavy, a lot of thoughts, and we have now arrived at the largest group of calls to action, which is injustice. Now, Dad was a judge. Wilton Littlechild, who's the other co-commissioner, Dr. Marie Wilson, came from the north. Every single one of them knew that the justice system is the last stop. So child welfare is the beginning point of the continuation of the residential school legacy. Health is an outcome of that, but the last stop for most people is the justice system. The justice system is where we see massive over incarceration of Indigenous peoples. It is most oftentimes in federal jails, provincial jails, and youth remand centers, youth correctional facilities. I could keep going and talk about this all day, but there's a reason that 17 calls to action, the largest group, are in justice because and there is so little done because justice in this country is seen as the most black and white issue. People have the opinion, if you do this, this should happen to you. There's no in between, there's no negotiation. And so we will see in justice some of the least action. Like, for example, take a look at these two right here. The federal government should establish a written policy that reaffirms the independence of the RCMP to investigate crimes in which the government has its own interest. Has not even touched, nothing has even come even close because the RCMP is very much a wing of the federal government, even though it's supposed to not be. It's supposed to be a policing service that's for everybody and is not supposed to have an opinion, but yet there it is. If you get a RCMP officer who's enforcing certain ideas, certain issues, they under 100 times, 100 out of 100 times, they will take the government side on issues. They will not recognize even First Nations jurisdiction from the band. They will not recognize Métis claims. They will not recognize Inuit claims in communities. And as a result, the RCMP is a wing of the federal government. So 25, not even touched. How about this one? We call upon the federal and provincial territorial governments to review their statutes of limitations to make sure that there is, when Indigenous peoples talk about historical abuses, that that's heard in a fair manner. Well, we still have not acknowledged that there is ongoing harms taking place through the Indian Act, through the ongoing marginalization of Manitoba Métis, Red River Métis here in Manitoba, or that in Inuit communities, it's not just even a matter of ongoing harms, it's chronic underfunding. There's people who are 13 people in a house in Iqaluit today because there is not enough housing. There is also not enough finance and economy, and the chronic underfunding of that group of people in that area of the world. The banning of things like hunting practices, the killing of sled dogs, the ongoing processes of marginalization of the education system, Inuit people. So it's like undermining or overtly treating Indigenous peoples as second-rate human beings, which you'd never let anybody go through that. And so when they bring forward that this is harming us, and the RCMP is supposed to recognize that that is a legitimate harm that the federal government is imposing, the federal government, the RCMP will say like, well, you're just complaining. Why don't you just, pick up your bootstraps or, why you complain and protest all the time? Or we won't take your claims seriously. 25, 26, not even touched. How about 27? 27 means that we got to make sure that lawyers receive appropriate cultural competency training. So that is happening in some law schools. But the second that it becomes a human rights issue, then always the TRC is deemed as an optional extracurricular. And in Alberta, they've now removed the TRC because certain lawyers have said that it is violations of their rights to an education, because it violates their what they can choose to study. And of course, because learning about Indigenous rights is some sort of deemed as optional by these lawyers, even though this is where you get the dumbness or the absolute insanity or the ignorance that imagines that you can just separate Alberta through a referendum. This is where incompetency comes from. You cannot separate in Alberta. Not only is it unconstitutional, but you cannot just jump out of the treaties. But yet this is where incompetent lawyers come from. And it comes from the Call to Actions 27 as being very much unevenly distributed throughout the country. Law schools are trying Call to Action 28. Like I'm thinking about Bor-Alaskan Law School in Thunder Bay. I'm thinking about Robson here in Manitoba. I'm thinking about, I just came from some of the work that's been done at University of Toronto. I can't remember what the name of that school is, but University of Toronto Law School, those kinds of things. Like there is elements that are being done, or Osgood at York University, there's some courses that are being offered. Sometimes they're mandatory and those kinds of things. But the problem is that are we really creating lawyers who have skill-based training. Look at the bottom of this call: in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. I would say most often not, or if they are, it's an optional extracurricular course than a mandatory one. Call to Action 29 is, that there are still issues that are going in the justice system that relate to residential schools. There are still overrepresented Indigenous peoples in federal prisons. We need to make sure that there is realistic alternatives to imprisonment. That means restorative justice practices. We have to make judges capable of not just throwing Indigenous peoples into jail, but looking at those restorative justice practices. We have to make sure that fetal alcohol syndrome, which is something that's a very big problem in communities, is dealt with or considered very specifically. Call to Action 34 is talking about the outcomes or the punishments for people who have FAST. Indigenous healing practices, 35. Culturally relevant services for inmates and supports for Indigenous peoples exiting prisons, that's 37. 38 is about the overrepresentation of Indigenous youth. 39 is about publishing reports to make sure that we're showing progress. We are not showing progress. There's more Indigenous peoples entering into the justice systems than ever before. Then, of course, to have Indigenous support victim programs, those who have been impacted. Well, the fact is that those who are being impacted are not even considered. So as you may have noticed from what I just did about 8 or 9 calls, I would say that almost no work at all. And if there is any work, they're very regional, very specific. There is no federal mandate. And there is no provincial mandate in most cases for any of these calls. And when I do see a success story, and I do, like, for example, when I see, for instance, let's go back to healing lodges in 35. There is a really wonderful youth program at the Manitoba Youth Centre, which is led by people who work there to help people to learn language, to spend some time on the land during their time in jail, and to get mentorship from Indigenous uncles like myself, who I've worked with, young men who are in prisons, to learn how to do ceremonies, but also to learn about positive choices in their life. One of the things that I'm doing May 19th is I am going to Stony Mountain Penitentiary to work with guys who are in a program called Walls to Bridges, which is where they are writing their own play, writing their own series of vignettes and stories that they can present publicly. And I say publicly for mostly guys who are in jail, but also their families, that they can perform a piece and give them a gift. And for their kids, so that the kids can watch their parents do something beautiful and do something remarkable. And so I'm speaking with those guys on May 19th. So, I would say that for all of these things are slowly experiencing. And then we hit Call to Action 41. Now, yesterday, May 5th, was Red Dress Day. Talk to anybody and ask them, has the issue of murdered missing Indigenous women and girls and the victimization or the brutality or the brutal oscillation or the oppression of Two-Spirit people has abated? And they will tell you absolutely not. The genocide, according to the National Inquiry for Murdered Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, is still continuing. But Call to Action 41 is technically done. Like, there was a national inquiry, there was a final report. It was government-led, which was probably why it was universally criticized, not efficient, and created a lot of acrimony, unlike the TRC, which brought a lot of people together. The national inquiry, which was government-led, probably wasn't delivered in a way, and for example, the families have in many ways not accepted the findings from the TRC, the national inquiry, because the families they didn't feel heard, they didn't feel supported, they didn't feel included. Bottom line of it is 41 is technically done because an inquiry did take place. There are 231 calls for justice, but because of acrimony, division, those calls to justice almost, if you were to say, like, how many of those have been picked up and implemented? Very few. And if they have, it's mostly been studies. Like, for instance, in Manitoba, there was a study issued for what's called a red dress alert. And that red dress alert, there was a study done, even an implementation plan. It was Indigenous led within a group of Indigenous women and grandmothers who led that research report. They published it last November. Nothing has happened since. That red dress alert is supposed to be on our phones right now. So when an Indigenous woman, girl, or Two-Spirit person goes missing, we get a red dress alert on our phones. We all keep an eye out. We all participate, help police services, paramedics, governments to be able to find people who go missing. And of course, that has never been implemented. And I invite you to read that report or find out what Leah Gazan, who is spearheading that fight in the federal government, but also what Indigenous peoples are saying about the calls for justice. Now, finally, 42 and 43 are about Indigenous justice systems. Sorry, 42 is, no, 43 is the United Nations Declaration. We're going to talk about that. Two study groups from now. The implementation of Indigenous justice systems is a personal mission of my father. Now, notice that this, like, remember we spent time with number one? I want to spend just a minute with 42. The goal of my father has always been for Indigenous peoples to run our own justice systems. And that was what he called the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry, or he recommended coming out 1988 here in Manitoba, where he co-led a commission, an inquiry called the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry. It's traveled all around Manitoba. They asked the question, what do Indigenous peoples want? Where can they get justice in a system in which justice is impossible? Which is law, like how do we implement? And what he said at the end, the number one thing was that we have to bring Indigenous law and we have to have it on par, recognized, enforceable with other laws that come from elsewhere, from British common law, for example, which is the basis for most Canadian law. And so Call to Action 42 is about Indigenous courts, yes, but it's also about Indigenous practices of justice. It's also about Indigenous police services. It's also about Indigenous peoples implementing systems in which justice and fairness isn't just about crime, although that's where people tend to think the most. It's also in taxation. It's also in family law. It's also in traffic. Like, we need to be thinking about the ways Indigenous peoples would think about all of those things. And an Indigenous justice system would be absolute. Like, where would it begin? Where would it end? Well, ask yourself where law, as it currently stands in Canada, begins and ends. It affects our relationship right now. We're under legal policies being online. We're follow legal business. We're part of a platform owned by a business, which then follows other laws. You and I are speaking using laws of free speech, for example, or I'm employed at a university, so I have academic freedom to say things as long as it's based in fact and not harmful to others. You will drive on streets following speed limits. You will, live in workplaces where there's human rights legislation and other laws. My whole point is that Indigenous. That's what Indigenous justice systems are ultimately intended to do, which is to give us opportunities to think unlike or alongside or on par with those systems of law that may at times not always be based in the laws of this place or the ideas of this place or the ways we live in this place. Like, for example, law that comes from elsewhere is based in a Judeo-Christian tradition of often binaristic thinking. You're this or you're that, and we separate you. There's no middle of the road. There's you, this happens to this. And Indigenous peoples aren't like that. We are and people. We are not or people. We are and people. And maybe law might be benefiting by thinking about and not so in black and white ways and so racially divisive ways, or based in ways that thinks it's creating justice, but actually is just in a series of injustice. Now, that's my email right there. Now, I think I deserve a massive gold star for in about an hour doing about, let's see, 17 for justice, 25 through 42, that's 7, that's 24, plus 5 for child welfare. 29 calls to action in 61 minutes. I think that's a gold star right there. Now, I don't mean to say that like yay for me, but I'm trying to do I'm trying to give you a sense that, as mentioned before, if you study those, Indigenous Watchdog, Yellowhead Institute, you're going to see that 14 are done. Technically, we've checked them. We've said they're done. 40, there's some action have been done for the calls to action, and 40 have never been touched. I'm far more interested in the 40 that have never been touched and the 40 that are in process than us ever saying we're done, because there will be no done. In fact, the ones that are done are even people debating whether they're done or not. My point is that there's, in certain cases, we're never going to see a pope apologizing, Call to Action 58. We just won't ever see that again. And so we can say that's done, and then try to move on to other things. But in the case of the National Inquiry, as an example, that one's done, but it's not really done. Like it's an inquiry, and there's 231 calls for justice. Um, Regardless of what we think of whether we like the process, we like the inquiry, whether the families were involved or not, we now have these 231 calls for justice. If you read them, I agree with almost all of them that they need to be implemented. And one of them could be the red dress alert system, or could be the fact that police services across jurisdictions don't talk to each other. And therefore, Indigenous women, when going missing, when they fall in between those cracks of those organizations, they don't speak. And therefore, often months go by before they do speak. And by that point, it's too late. By that point, there's harm has taken place. By that point, harm has gone on to create other harm in the child welfare system, for example. So if somebody gets abused, for example, and then somebody comes in, a child welfare social worker who is incompetent, and then says, oh, well, we just got to remove the children, that just creates more harm because, and et cetera, et cetera. So what we've got is calls to justice, so is call to action 40 really done, or is it not? Or is it 41? Whatever the inquiry one is it done? Is it not? And so some of them are done. So let's have a conversation now about some of the calls that I talked about, what you're interested in, and then particularly what are ways that we can implement those on a micro basis, because what you heard is a macro, these kind of big country approach. And I touched upon a few regional ways that you can deal with this, but how might you imagine you picking one of those calls, taking it as a personal mission, and then implementing it? Like, for example, call to action 5, developing healthy parenting child programs for Indigenous peoples. Like, if you worked with Indigenous peoples, this might be easier, but if you don't work with Indigenous peoples, how might you support one? Could you do an action in your territory which would then fundraise or offer support in resources, or take a learning or a knowledge that you have in your personal life and then offer that to others to help them understand why this is an important call to action? Because whenever I get asked, what can I do personally? I don't know Indigenous peoples. The first thing I always say is, yes, you do. You just don't maybe see them. You don't, or have been taught to see them. Second is that we can do anything. It's the number one thing you could do is talk about this more. Bring it up in your everyday conversations and your coffee shops. And most importantly, talk to people who would never listen to me. Because, Canadians have been taught that Indigenous peoples have nothing important to say, or that we're so angry and damaged that we are violent and therefore, have some sort of agenda. And my agenda? My agenda is, I hope that we're all kind to my daughter. I hope that my daughter's kind to your children. That's my agenda. Apparently it's like, that's so violent because Niigaan Sinclair is so angry. Like, why the heck am I doing this session on a Wednesday at noon for the North York Community Center, community health, or for all of you? Like, I do it because, there's no parade in my honor. There's no huge financial accolades. Like, here's why I do it. I do it because my hope is that if we just talk enough, if we just learn with each other enough, laugh enough, cry enough, if we just share enough food, that we can believe, communicate, and change the world. That's why I do this. I do this because my dad taught me to do it. My dad taught me that if we just visit each other's courtrooms, boardrooms, living rooms, classrooms, amazing things happen. And one of those amazing things, right now, this online study series together, the fact that 200 people showed up on your lunch hour tells me that you're interested, you're engaged, you've been inspired by Dad. And not just Dad, but also Indigenous peoples and your parents who met those people along the road, taught you that this issue matters. And you did the crazy thing, like say, okay, well, I'm going to take time out of my day, my personal time. I'm going to go do something. And on some days you wear an orange shirt. On some days you come to a noon hour seminar. On other days you vote, you bring in governments that are progressive, and you help the world become an inclusive, progressive, and most importantly, efficient place where wealth is distributed, where the world is full of recognition of each other, and another word for that, peace, justice, fairness, or kanata. you helped this country become what it's supposed to be, or what it was supposed to be in the first place, which was a place not of violence and division and genocide, but a place that isn't those things. That is something else. That is the village where people share and believe in each other. And if you remember my last series that I did for you, I talked to you all about the term kanata. That's about how we share medicines and believe in each other and care for each other's kids. That's what's supposed to represent this place, because the winter is coming and we can't survive alone. We have to help each other. So, all right. So thanks. We'll do some questions here, although I've just realized that I'm at 9% of my computer. So if there was a question, I'm just going to quickly plug in while you ask that, but I am listening. And I don't know who to hand it to. Bonnie?
Joan?
Joan?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here. I'm here.
Joan's going to do
Oh, there we go. What do you see? I see a lot of thank you. Amazing. Thank you. Thank you.
Ramji, I think has a
I see
question.
Ranjith. Ranjith has a question. Here's.
Hi. Yes, I just posted the two definitions to expose the hypocrisy of Canada when it comes to the definition of the word genocide, and it has adopted.
Keep talking. I'm just going to grab my plug. Okay, keep talking. I'm just going to grab my plug.
Yeah. So Canada has one-to-one adopted certain sections of the United Nations definition, Article 2, and conveniently, purposefully avoided certain sections. The sections that are avoided, I highlighted in blue. One is causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. And C, a section, deliberate inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. And D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. And E, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So I would like your views on this.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks, Ranjith. Okay. So we're actually not going to talk about genocide this study group because I thought it was too big an issue. And so if you, not that I want to divert your question, and certainly I think that the issue of genocide has to be spoken about, but I'm just going to go back to the topics here. So here we go. There's that. Okay. So if you go to topics in our study group right here. So, so, I guess I sort of don't. I was planning on dealing with this in session 3, but I realized I didn't put it in a little breakdown there. Sorry. My goal is to talk a little bit about why the TRC used the term cultural genocide to describe what took place in residential schools. Now, it has a lot to do with the things that Ranjith just spoke about, which is now the federal government is extremely uncomfortable, and I hope that actually I'll stop share there. Sorry, the federal government is extremely uncomfortable of getting into the issues of genocide because the previous federal government, that was the government 2 previous ago, that was Stephen Harper, was very uncomfortable of reopening the litigation of residential schools, and they also knew that on the horizon there would be a court action when it came to day schools. Because, but the fact was that the writing was on the wall and there was unquestionably the fulfillment of harm, or that harm took place of Indigenous children, which was state-sponsored and led by churches. So they knew that the settlement agreement had to create some kind of, there had to be some kind of remedy to that harm. And so that's where the settlement amount, or what's called the settlement agreement, came from, which was a financial compensation. And that's where the TRC came, because the survivors took 90% of the compensation they were offered and paid for the TRC. That wasn't paid for by the government. It was paid for by the survivors, who then offered that money, and they paid for the TRC. Now, the federal government, part of what they did to control the TRC is they said to the TRC, you cannot use the term genocide because we do not recognize it as a federal genocide. Now, that means that certain parts, though, are evidence of genocide. And as Ranjith pointed out, The federal government's been very checkerboard with recognizing residential schools. They aren't that way, by the way, anymore since the papal visit of 2021 through 2022. The papal visit. Sorry, brain cramp. And when the Pope came here, the Pope recognizes it as genocide, and then the federal government recognized it as genocide unanimously following the papal visit because the Pope recognized it, and that put public pressure on for MPs to recognize it, which tells you pressure works sometimes. And so now it is officially recognized as a genocide. But the second thing is that it just, notice the country didn't fall apart when it was recognized as a genocide. And it did not open up massive issues of litigation because the settlement agreement was something that Indigenous peoples came to in good faith. And many of them signed on to that settlement agreement, agreeing that we were going to move forward from that issue. Now, that didn't mean everybody, but it did mean a significant amount of people. But one of the things that have happened since is now the day school agreement has taken place. People have received financial compensation for attending day schools. And of course, not anywhere near what the cost of a childhood would be. But that being said, that there is a process in which there has been some compensation as a result of the recognition of that genocide. But there's still certain segments of Canadian society, governments in particular, and provincial governments. I'm thinking about looking at you, Alberta, that have resisted using terms like genocide and have been outright vociferously disagreeing with the federal government's acceptance of the term of genocide. For instance, that Justin Trudeau recognized that a genocide is happening amongst Indigenous peoples. That's one of the findings of the National Inquiry of Indigenous Women and Girls, is that there is a genocide happening. Justin Trudeau has said, we accept it, but nothing changed. Like if I told you that a genocide was taking place of this group of people today, you as a Canadian would have absolute support, probably engagement, interest. You probably go to your phones and look it up. But when Indigenous peoples claim a genocide is happening, everybody thinks it's some kind of agenda or sometimes attempt to get money or some kind of an attempt to, take away, distract from corrupt chiefs or something or other. And so we still have this problem of education, misinformation, and miseducation in the country. And evidence of that is we're debating about what to do about murder, missing Indigenous women and girls. Hey everybody, newsflash! They're searching for a woman named Ashley Shingoose today in a landfill in Winnipeg after finding evidence, proof of what two women that had been previously in a different landfill. So women are ending up in landfills. And instead of doing something to stop that process or stepping up police services, but most importantly, Indigenous engagement with those police services to create competency, implementing the Red Dress Alert project, those kinds of things, the federal government and at times the provincial government, although we have a very progressive provincial government here in Manitoba, is really dragging their heels, really going, really? Do we really got it? Is this really a problem? Like what Stephen Harper said of why he refused to accept that there would be a national inquiry or to ever implement it is because he said the problem is that women make bad choices or women get into bad situations or women are to blame for their own circumstances. And that was literally what the reasoning of why they never had a national inquiry. They said it was a systemic issue or a regional issue or about lifestyle choices. Like that was the actual term that Bernard Valcourt, the completely miseducation, misinformation, and downright racism. And that's still part of it. I think what the answer to Ranjith's point there is that when we see genocide, Canada is still very checkerboard, still debating the terms of it, but they have accepted it. Technically, even though nothing has been done about it. Or very little has been done. Now, the federal government will tell me, I can actually, let's imagine that my good friend, Gary Indesangari, was watching this right now. If he would actually call me afterwards and text me and go, we're having a study group, we're having a national forum, we're consulting. And my point back to that would be we can consult till the cows come home. We can consult for forever. We can continue to talk about these issues, but if we never get anywhere, then what was the point? And I've said that to Gary many times. I've said it to my very good friend, Mark Miller, as well. Wonderful guy. But he's also in a tough situation too, because one size fit all is never for First Nations or Métis communities, and it is tough. It's tough to implement these things too. So I give a little bit of empathy to those who are trying to do things, because those are two very good people, just like Rebecca Chartrand, Rebecca Alty, Buckley Belanger, Mandy Galmasty. These are all good people. I've met them. I've had coffee with them. I hung out with Mandy Galmasty the other day in Ottawa, and she's a woman who deeply cares about community, language, culture. But we don't agree on lots of issues, and I think that there's always more that can be done. But anyways, I see that. Is it Yania?
Hello, yes, Yania. I work with the YWCA and I'm a supervisor of a childcare. And this is my first time, and so overwhelming to hear this stuff, because no matter how I search on my own, I was not, exposed to these kind of information. But what caught my eye with the child welfare, and it is devastating, the percentage, like in PEI is 0%, in Quebec is 17%, in Ontario is 30%. And I was wondering, is it because of the population of the Indigenous people is like that, or because of the system, is it working better, or what did contribute to that kind of percentage across the provinces?
So this would be like a whole talk on child welfare. So I'll do the best I can. Like I said, I apologize you feel overwhelmed. One thing that I hope, though, is that you understand that if I can do this in an hour, if I can take 29 calls and sort of jam them together, just remember that I've spent my whole life doing this, right? So I'm 50 years old, and I'm born into this, and I have a PhD, and I teach intro at university. My job is to stand beside you and to empower you. And just like teachers, I've said to social workers, you don't get in this business to harm people. Like if you're a childcare worker, if you're working in childcare, you have the crazy idea that every child matters already. Because why else do you do it, right? And just on a personal note, and I don't want to get all, is our faiths have that at their heart too. And whether you believe in Jesus, or whether you believe in Islam, or whether you believe in our lodge and our tradition, at the center, at the core of our teachings is that our job is to create a better world for our children. A world full of love, a world full of that's why I go to prayers on Friday in the mosque. I've never felt closer to Anishinaabe than when I'm doing prayers in the mosque. I actually always think of Islam and Anishinaabe as very much intertwined, they're very similar teachings. But anyways, my point of it is just I don't have a simple answer for you, but what I'll just say is that the chronic mistreatment of Indigenous peoples in law, practice, and policy has been from the very beginning, and even before the beginning, going back to the Royal Proclamation, the Papal Bulls. And the position has always been that Indigenous peoples are savages, Saracens, enemies of Christ. And that's the actual words of the Pope back in the 15th century. And it was non-Christians. The original laws that were intended to harm people in Africa, and what's often called the Middle East, although I know it's a terrible term, but were just picked up and then transplanted to what's now Turtle Island or North America, right? And so because they didn't think we existed, or for the most part weren't aware of us. And so in 1452, when the Catholic Church issues the Dum Dervasis and says non-Christians are enemies of Christ, or savages and Saracens, and have no rights, and have the rights of their lands taken away by Christians who encounter them, that's then picked up, which was intended for the Holy Wars or the Crusades or whatever you want to call it, and then boom, transplanted to North America and then imposed upon Indigenous peoples. Now in 1530, there is a court trial in Valladolid, Spain, between in the Catholic Church. There's a debate of, are Indigenous peoples humans? And the decision is that Indigenous peoples, we don't know. We're gonna try to convert them, which is a kind of a middle road approach. And it was mostly because the church needed laborers, and eventually this will become, of course, the slave system that then becomes part of the building of the North American economy. But the intention was that Indigenous peoples would become slaves. And that was the attempt to see them as deficient, lesser than human beings. Anyways, I got very deep there. My whole point is that then becomes Canadian law in 1867, that Indigenous peoples are lesser than humans. They have to be controlled. They have to have their children taken away and turned into laborers, because the residential school system was a slave system. And that's, I don't use that term without understanding that that's a very heavy way to describe it, because children did not have to go to school, did not have to go to class. They didn't have to go to church even until the 1950s. There was no law put into place. So what often happened is these schools were intending to fundraise for the mission of Christians. And they were working in the schools. They were selling the things that they sowed. They were working in farmers' fields. And then they would raise money from that to build not just the school, which had already been built, but to build the church in town and to spread the missionization of the Christian message. And the problem, of course, is that's the epitome of slavery. If you are bringing people in to use their labor, regardless of the fact they're 5, 6, 7 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old, whatever it might be, and you are benefiting from their servitude, that's a slave system. And so in the 1950s, they finally brought in the mandate that people had to attend classes, but only one per day. So oftentimes that would be things like Bible study, or it might be, if you're lucky, reading and writing. Never mathematics so that you would enter the middle class. Never. The intention of the residential school system was to create an under labor class, servants and farmhands for Canadians, farmers, for Canadian middle class people, business people intended. Anyways, my point is the residential school failed on one level. We've survived. We are still proud of ourselves. We have, nations that are in states of recovery and resurgence. But on another level, it did succeed on the level that it put us into a very serious, dangerous underclass, low income, poverty based, therefore traumatized, leading to all these other determinants I spoke about, addictions, living in tents, lower income, less life expectancy, lower educational attainment, therefore labor-based jobs or blue-collar jobs, which are low-paying and keep people in certain neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. Only path out oftentimes for young people might be gangs, selling drugs, crime, those kinds of things. And of course, not everybody, but I'm talking about the vast majority for a long period of time. And that is all shifting and changing now. But child welfare, as you are seeing in childcare, is most oftentimes the most impacted. Like when people are attacked or oppressed, take, for example, what's happening in Iran. When people are bombed, who suffers the most? The elderly and the children. Third place, women. And of course, all three combined are atrocious. That's where genocide begins, or that's where genocide's happening. And of course, men are impacted too. Of course they are. So are, But my point of it is that you're at the front line doing that child work.
Thank you. I just want to say it's overwhelmingly good. It was not as overwhelming as, but it opened my eye, and I'm willing to take it further. So thank you so much.
Yeah, great. And just know that you have a brother here. I love all you guys. This is why I'm doing this, and this is why Joan has brought me in. I hope is because I do this work because I know how hard it is. I was a teacher, I was a grade 9 teacher. I was a grade 9 teacher, and grade 9's tough year for those kids because they enter high school first time, and I just realized as being a grade 9 teacher, it would set me up for all this other thing. But the most important thing that I've ever been invested in, which is why Dad, was empathy and appreciation. And I'll always stand by somebody who believes that all of us belong here, that all of us are a part of this, and Indigenous peoples are the number one people who do that for you. Whenever you see a protest or a point in which you see the indigenous community and policing or military or a government force of some kind, ask yourself who has the guns and who has the drums. Who's invested in peace and who's invested in conflict? Ask yourself, who's thinking about tomorrow here? And I guarantee you, it's not the ones carrying the guns. The ones who are carrying the drums are the ones who are hey, how are we going to live together? How's our kids going to live together? And most importantly is like that's what we're doing, man. Like you're at the front lines and bring the love, man.
Dude, you're cut off. We're fantastic as usual. I feel like I ran the marathon through the calls to action. No, I'm so happy to hear that the school is celebrating your father. Are you gone? That has to be incredibly moving for you all. You must feel pretty good about that.
Nice. Yeah, it'd be nice. It's that's nice. It's actually one of three, but this isn't the one that I really like. Don't tweet this out. But this one tonight is one that's in the city. It's in a fairly affluent area. It's an immersion school, but it's the one that I really care about is the dad's old high school, which is now a junior high. That's in Selkirk. They are becoming École Murray Sinclair Middle School in September.
Oh, nice. What is it now?
That's the one that really that's the one that I'm probably going to cry at because when they showed us the logo and they did the unveiling with the staff the other day, they read Dad's valedictorian speech from grade 12. He was the valedictorian, and they read it out to everybody. Of course, we were all crying, and it was pretty beautiful. Dad was a 60-year-old punk at the time, so naming that school after Dad is very emotional. This one is it's important, but it's like just a step in the process. There's also one in Ontario, by the way. It's going through the community consultation, so there's going to be one in Ontario named after Dad too.
Nice. Well, we'll have to be there for that one, depending where it is. Bonnie, did you want to say anything?
It's my greatest nightmare to follow Niigaan and have to talk.
I know. That's why I said you can do it.
like Yanni said, I mean, it's an incredible amount of information in the time we've been together, and you get all the gold stars. But I have to say, I've never been part of a speaker series where I've seen so many hearts. And little celebration emojis, and I think that's just a testament to how you weave together all of these huge foundational pieces of information into your own life, into the history of your community, into the work we're doing today. It's such a gift. And I'm so glad so many people got to be part of this, because it really is an extraordinary experience. I've had little messages during this saying, I can't believe this. I'm so glad I'm here. So thank you so much. I want to thank our partners, the Neighborhood Group and the Toronto Southwest Lit, because I just think this is such a huge and important tool that hopefully we can share. But thank you, Chimungwech. This is the beginning of a really amazing journey, I think, for all of us.
Okay, thanks everybody. And like I said, I'm hoping to. There may be a need to play on some of the dates that are coming in the next 4 weeks, or we're doing every 2 weeks now, I think. There is one of those 4 that's going to be maybe not as long as the other ones, and so, but I'll get back to where people are on that, and I'll give people a heads up on when that happens. So, for some reason, something's bugging in my brain that one of them have to be 75 minutes instead of 90, but we'll work it out when we get there. But thanks very much, everybody. Niigaan Wewidam Sinclair. Till the next time. I'm happy to send someone the slides. So Bonnie, maybe I'll send it to you, or
sure.
Yeah, okay. And then I don't know if you want to set up some sort of platform underneath on that page, the slides from the 4 sessions. Maybe just upload something people can download, and that way they have a copy of what the calls to action look like. So I'll send that to you. Okay.
Great.
All right.
Thank you.
You got Niigaan Wewidam. See you later. Okay. Bye.
Bye.